Every culture has asked the same question in different languages. What is it that truly lives in us? And what is it that continues when we die? From the earliest hymns of the Vedas to the dialogues of Plato and the sermons of medieval theologians, there has been the intuition that behind the stream of experience there must be something stable, some essence that observes without changing while the body and the world transform. The English word soul, the Sanskrit Atman, the Greek psyche, and the Chinese Linghuan all seem to point toward the same invisible core, a permanent witness, a traveler from birth to birth. Buddhism entered this conversation and overturned it completely. The Buddha did not begin by denying the soul out of rebellion or skepticism. He began by observing experience with precision. When he looked closely at what we call a person, he did not find a fixed owner hidden behind the flow. He found processes, sensations, perceptions, feelings, impulses, and consciousness, all moving in dependence on conditions. He called these panca khandha, the five aggregates. When the body is examined, it is changing. When feeling is examined, it arises and fades. When perception is examined, it depends on contact and memory. When intention is examined, it depends on desire and habit. When consciousness is examined, it flickers like a lamp in the wind. In none of these could he find a permanent core that could be called mine. From this direct observation came the doctrine of anatta, no permanent self. This teaching was not a philosophical speculation, but an experiment in liberation. In ancient India, the Upanishads had described the Atman as eternal, uncreated, and identical with Brahman, the ultimate ground of reality. The Buddha's insight challenged this metaphysical comfort. He saw that clinging to the idea of an eternal self is itself the root of suffering. Because we believe something in us can be protected or perfected forever, we struggle endlessly to defend it. The Buddha's question was practical. When we examine the mind at the moment of pain or fear, can we find an entity that suffers apart from the process of suffering itself? If not, why cling to the illusion? To illustrate this, the Buddha used analogies that remain powerful even in modern terms. He compared the self to a flame being passed from one lamp to another. The new lamp is lit by the old, yet no substance travels. Continuity without identity. He compared it to a river whose water is never the same, yet whose shape and direction persist through causes. The idea of a stream of becoming, Bhava Sota, anticipates what modern physics calls continuity through process rather than through matter. Some early critics accused Buddhism of nihilism, of denying that anything exists at all. But that is a misunderstanding. The Buddha denied permanence, not presence. What exists is not a static being, but a dynamic pattern of dependent arising, paticca samuppada. This principle states that all phenomena arise when conditions support them and fade when those conditions cease. There is causality, but no unchanging substance behind it. The flame burns because of fuel, oxygen, and spark. Remove the causes, and it goes out. What we call a person is a coordination of causes. physical, emotional, cognitive, karmic. And what we call rebirth is the continuation of those causal streams, not the migration of a fixed soul. When we move from early Buddhism to later Mahayana interpretations, the insight deepens. The concept of shunyata, emptiness, taught by Nagarjuna, declares that not only the self, but all things are empty of independent essence. Yet emptiness does not mean nothingness. It means that everything exists interdependently. The flower is made of sunlight, rain, soil, and countless unseen relations. The self, likewise, is made of language, memory, perception, and relationship. When those conditions shift, the pattern shifts. This understanding aligns surprisingly with modern science. Neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and even physics describe a world of process without permanent substances. Brain imaging shows that what we call the self corresponds to networks of activity rather than to a single center. The sense of ownership over thoughts and sensations is a construction of the brain's default mode network, which integrates memory, attention, and prediction into a coherent narrative. When this network quiets in meditation, in deep flow, or under certain altered states, the boundaries of self temporarily dissolve. People report the same insight the Buddha described 25 centuries ago. Experience continues, but the I that claims it disappears. Modern cognitive scientists like Thomas Metzinger call the self a transparent model, a simulation the brain uses to organize control and prediction. It feels real because we cannot see its construction. Experiments on split-brain patients, on confabulation, and on false memories reveal that the sense of continuity is a storytelling function, not an independent observer. In Buddhism, this narrative continuity is precisely what produces clinging the illusion that there is a solid me who owns experience, rather than experience unfolding according to causes. Quantum physics, too, has dethroned the notion of fixed essence. Particles are now understood as excitations of underlying fields, flickering in and out of existence. Identity at the subatomic level is relational. An electron is defined not by intrinsic substance, but by its interactions. The boundary between observer and observed becomes fuzzy. In this light, the Buddhist teaching of interdependence sounds less mystical and more descriptive. There is no isolated particle, no isolated person, only networks of conditions giving rise to temporary patterns. The question then arises, if there is no soul, who is reborn? The Buddha's answer was that rebirth is not the return of a self, but the continuation of causal momentum. Actions, speech, and thought plant tendencies, sankhara, which shape the next arising of consciousness. When conditions dissolve at death, those tendencies continue like a wave transferring energy across water. The next moment of experience, whether in this world or another, is conditioned by the last. The process is lawful, not personal. In the Milinda Panha, the monk Nagasena explained this to King Milinda through the simile of a mango seed. The fruit that grows from the seed is not the same, yet not entirely different. The relation is causal, not substantial. Philosophically, this is a middle path between eternalism and annihilationism. The eternalist insists that something unchanging survives forever. The annihilationist insists that death ends everything. The Buddha refused both extremes. Continuity exists, but not identity. The pattern of causes continues, but the ownership is empty. This view avoids the logical problems of eternal souls, such as how a changeless self could interact with change, and also avoids the despair of pure materialism, which cannot explain moral continuity or experience itself. Western philosophy has its own echoes of this insight. David Hume, in the 18th century, analyzed the mind and found no impression of a self apart from a bundle of perceptions. He wrote that what we call a person is a bundle tied by memory and habit. Existentialists like Sartre later described consciousness as a nothingness that projects itself into the world through choice. Both observations resonate with anatta. Consciousness is dynamic, not static. Even the phenomenology of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, which emphasizes perception as an active relation between body and world, parallels the Buddhist insight that experience arises in mutual dependence. In recent decades, studies in neurophenomenology have tried to bridge subjective experience and objective data. When long-term meditators describe the dissolution of self-boundaries, scanners show decreased activity in brain regions associated with self-referential processing. The scientific language differs from the Buddhist one, but the observation converges. The sense of self is contingent and can be quieted through training. This leads to a deeper question. If there is no self, who practices, who awakens, who is responsible? The Buddha answered by pointing to the reality of causal function. When you press a seed into soil, a sprout emerges. You do not need an eternal gardener hiding inside the seed. In the same way, wholesome actions produce clarity. Unwholesome actions produce confusion. Responsibility does not require a permanent self, only the continuity of cause and effect. Freedom arises when causes that lead to suffering are understood and abandoned. From an ethical view, the doctrine of no self is not cold, but compassionate. If no being exists independently, then harm to another rebounds through the web that includes oneself. This recognition erodes the barriers of ego and tribe. Compassion, karuna, becomes rational as well as emotional. When the illusion of separateness weakens, cooperation replaces competition as the sane response to reality. From a psychological view, the idea of selflessness does not erase individuality. It reveals that personality is a dynamic configuration. Just as music exists only while the notes move, a person exists while body, memory, and intention cooperate. Trying to freeze that movement into an identity produces suffering. Allowing it to play freely produces grace. Some scientists now use the language of emergence to describe this. Complex systems generate properties not found in their parts. Consciousness emerges from neurons. Society emerges from individuals. Identity emerges from experience. But emergence is conditional. The pattern depends on relationships. This matches the Buddhist claim that the self is a convention, useful for communication, but empty of essence. Critics sometimes ask whether this view undermines meaning. If there is no immortal soul, why strive for goodness or wisdom? The Buddhist reply is that meaning does not depend on eternity. Fire burns, light shines, kindness relieves suffering. Their value does not require permanence. In fact, the recognition of impermanence makes each act more urgent and precious. The fragility of life is not a flaw. It is what gives compassion its depth. Modern psychology supports this shift. Research on self-transcendence shows that when people experience moments beyond ego through meditation, art, or awe, they report greater well-being and altruism. The dissolving of rigid self-boundaries leads not to emptiness, but to fullness of connection. The neural correlate is reduced activity in the midline structures associated with self-focus, accompanied by increased integration across sensory and emotional networks. In simple terms, the brain functions more harmoniously when the sense of I relaxes. The Buddhist map of mind anticipated this through the training of samadhi and vipassana. Concentration steadies attention, and insight observes impermanence and non-self directly. The result is nibbana, the cooling of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. Here, the absence of a soul is not a loss, but a liberation. If there is no fixed self to defend, then change is not a threat. Death is not the destruction of an owner, but the transformation of conditions. Comparative religion finds parallels but not identities. The Hindu Atman seeks union with Brahman, a merging of the individual with the cosmic whole. The Christian soul seeks communion with God, preserved in divine memory. The Buddhist path seeks understanding that releases clinging altogether. It does not deny the sacred. It relocates it. Sacredness lies in the interdependence itself, not in a hidden essence. In China, this teaching was reinterpreted through the lens of Taoist cosmology. Texts from the Tang dynasty describe the no-self not as voidness, but as natural harmony with the flow of Tao. The Chan masters spoke of the mind like a mirror that reflects without holding. When there is no fixed self, perception is immediate, unclouded by possession. In Japan, Zen poets turned this insight into art. Basho wrote of the old pond and the frogs splash awareness without observer. The no-self becomes not a concept, but a mode of being. Complete participation in the moment. Science, philosophy, and Buddhism converge here. Each, in its own language, says that identity is process, not property. The physicist describes energy transformation, the biologist describes evolutionary adaptation, the psychologist describes narrative construction, and the Buddhist describes dependent arising. None can find an unchanging kernel behind the dance. Still, human longing persists. We want to believe that something in us endures untouched. Buddhism does not mock that longing. It redirects it. The desire for permanence is transformed into the search for what does not depend on craving. The stillness of insight, the compassion that does not contract. These are not things possessed by a self, but qualities that shine when self-clinging subsides. When the Buddha was asked directly, "Is there a self?" he remained silent. The silence was not ignorance. It was skillful. Any answer yes or no would solidify a concept and miss the point. The question itself assumes a fixed category. The Buddha's method was experiential. Look, see what is actually present, and watch how everything changes. The seeing itself is the answer. To live this understanding is not to erase personality or joy. It is to live lightly. The body moves, the mind thinks, emotions rise and fade, but no owner hides behind them. Responsibility continues. Compassion continues. But the burden of mind loosens. The result is freedom that does not depend on metaphysical belief. If you ask again, does Buddhism believe in a soul? The most accurate reply is this: Buddhism believes in responsibility without ownership, in continuity without identity, in compassion without boundary. It believes that what we call a self is a useful story written on flowing water. When that is seen clearly, fear subsides, and the water reflects the sky.